She sat across from one of the most powerful men in America and told him he had a choice. The dining room was still, not the comfortable kind of stillness that settles over a house at the end of a long day. This was the silence of held breath, of a moment balanced on its edge. The silverware hadn't been touched. The food had gone cold, and Celeste Hargrove, 23 years old, sat with her hands flat on the table and her eyes fixed on her father like she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in the dark. Maybe she had, because what she knew, what she had spent months piecing together, carefully and without anyone's help, was not the kind of thing you stumble across and forget. It was the kind of thing that rewires you, that makes you look back at every birthday dinner, every late-night phone call that stopped the moment you walked into the room, every gift that arrived without explanation, and understand, finally, what you were really seeing. And now she was going to say it out loud. Have you ever known something that could hurt someone you love and had to decide whether to say it? Not a suspicion, not a rumor, something real, something confirmed, something sitting in your chest like a stone you cannot put down, and the person on the other side of that truth is someone whose love you have never once questioned, even when everything else was in doubt. That is the position Celeste was in, and it is one of the most quietly devastating places a person can stand. What makes this story so difficult to look away from is not the scandal. And there is one. It is not the money, the power, or the carefully maintained image of a family that, from the outside, appeared to have everything arranged just right. What makes it impossible to look away is the tension at its center. A daughter who loved her father, and a truth that love could not override. Loyalty versus honesty. Protection versus accountability. The version of someone you grew up believing in versus the version the evidence insists is real. There is a particular kind of courage that does not look like courage from the outside. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with certainty or with the comfort of knowing how things will turn out on the other side. It arrives quietly, in an ordinary room, at a table set for two, in the form of a young woman who has decided that she is no longer willing to look away from what she knows. Celeste Hargrove was 23 years old the night she sat across from her father and changed the direction of both their lives. She was not angry. She was not reckless. She was simply, completely and irrevocably done with silence. By the end of this story, you will understand why the most dangerous thing Celeste Hargrove ever did was simply pay attention. Welcome to the channel. If you are new here, this is where we tell true stories about the moments that change everything, the decisions, the silences, the revelations that redefine a life. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss one, because this story is only just beginning. Warren Hargrove did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He was the kind of man who communicated in calibrated pauses, a slight tightening around the eyes, a stillness in the jaw that told you, without a single word, that you had said something wrong. He had built his fortune the same way he built everything else, methodically, without sentiment, with the long view always in mind. Real estate, private equity, political friendships maintained like business assets. His name appeared on buildings, on donor lists, on the lips of people who understood that in certain rooms, his approval carried more weight than almost anything else. He was not cruel, he was precise, and somehow that was worse. The Hargrove estate sat at the end of a private road in Connecticut. 11,000 square feet of immaculate restraint, no excess for its own sake. Everything chosen, everything considered. The kind of house that felt less like a home and more like a statement about the person who owned it. There were staff who moved through it so quietly you could forget they existed. Rooms that were cleaned daily, but rarely occupied. A dining table that seated 16 and was set formally every evening, whether guests were coming or not, because that was simply how things were done in the Hargrove household. From the outside, it looked like the life people spend entire careers trying to earn. From the inside, it echoed. Celeste had been shaped by that world, the way topiary is shaped, carefully, consistently, with a very clear idea of the final form. The right schools, the right summers abroad, the right galas, where she stood beside her father, and smiled at the right people, and said exactly enough to be charming without saying anything at all. Her wardrobe was considered. Her friendships were, without either party quite realizing it, pre-approved. Even her interests, art history, classical piano, a brief but celebrated season on the equestrian circuit, had a curated quality, as though someone had assembled them from a catalog titled Daughters of Consequence. She performed the role flawlessly. She always had. And the world rewarded her for it without ever asking what it cost her to maintain. But here is what that performance concealed. Celeste Hargrove noticed everything. Not in the loud, disruptive way of someone who wants to be seen noticing, but in the careful way of someone who learned very early that the most important information in any room was never the information being offered. It was the information being withheld. She catalogued things. A phone call her father took in the hallway instead of his office. A name that appeared once in a conversation and was never mentioned again. The way certain guests, perfectly warm all evening, went rigid for exactly 3 seconds when Warren Hargrove entered the room. She filed these things away. She did not yet know why, but some part of her understood, even then, that the filing would eventually matter. The most difficult thing about Celeste's life was not that it was hard, it was that it wasn't. And yet something essential was missing from it anyway. She was not unhappy in any way she could easily name or justify. She had comfort, security, access, and opportunity. She had a father who provided everything a daughter could materially need and who showed up, reliably, to every important occasion. He was present in all the measurable ways. But presence and closeness are not the same thing. And Celeste had grown up alongside a man who kept the most important parts of himself behind a door that was always, without explanation, closed. She had learned over time not to knock. But she knocked anyway, in her own way, through watching, through cataloging, through the patient accumulation of everything she was never directly told. That is the world Celeste Hargrove grew up inside. Not a harsh world, not a dramatic one, not on the surface. A beautiful, orderly, well-resourced world that had been arranged, with enormous care, to look exactly like happiness. And for a long time she accepted the arrangement. Because when you are raised inside a gilded frame, you can spend years believing the frame is the picture. It was only later, when she was old enough to step back and look at the whole image rather than the individual details, that she began to see what had always been there, present in every room, at every table, behind every carefully maintained smile. Not a crack, a pattern. And patterns, once seen, cannot be unseen. He did not announce himself. That was the first thing Celeste noticed about Adrian Cole. Not his face, not the calm authority with which he moved through a room. It was the absence of an announcement. In a world where every person her father employed had been trained to project competence like a second uniform, Adrian simply was competent. There was no performance attached to it. He had joined the Hargrove household staff as head of private security 18 months before Celeste returned from her second year abroad, recommended through 3 layers of trusted referral, vetted to a degree that most government contractors would find excessive. Warren Hargrove did not hire carelessly. Adrian Cole was not a careless hire. He was exceptionally good at becoming part of the background of a room, steady, present, and entirely without the need for acknowledgement, until the precise moment he was needed. The first real moment between them happened in an elevator. Celeste had been running late for a breakfast meeting on the 42nd floor of her father's Manhattan tower, the kind of meeting she attended not because she had been formally invited, but because she had learned, over years, that the most useful conversations in the Hargrove world happened in rooms she technically had no reason to be in. The elevator doors were closing. Adrian was already inside. He saw her coming, 3, maybe 4 seconds away, and held the door, not with the flat-handed urgency of someone trying to be visibly helpful. He held it without ceremony, without making a production of the gesture, and then said nothing when she stepped in. He simply pressed the button for 42. She had not told him which floor she needed. The second moment was smaller, and somehow more significant. Celeste had a standing arrangement with a florist in the West Village. White chrysanthemums, delivered every Thursday to her apartment, a habit she had carried home from a winter spent in Kyoto that she had never fully explained to anyone and never felt she needed to. It was one of the few things in her life that was entirely her own. One Thursday, the delivery did not arrive. The florist had sent them to the townhouse by mistake, the Hargrove family residence, not her apartment. When she arrived at the townhouse that evening, the arrangement was sitting on her usual windowsill, rerouted, already in water. Adrian had not mentioned it. There was no note. He had simply corrected the problem before she knew it existed. Then came the gala. It was a charity event, the kind Warren Hargrove attended 4 or 5 times a year, where the cause was secondary to the room, and the room was secondary to the connections being made across it. Celeste had been positioned, as she always was at these events, slightly to her father's left, close enough to be visible, far enough not to interrupt. Halfway through the evening, a man she had been introduced to 3 separate times over the years, and who had, each time, introduced himself as though they had never met, extended his hand to her with fresh enthusiasm, and said her name incorrectly. She smiled. She had years of practice holding the smile. She glanced across the room. Adrian, stationed near the far wall, had seen the entire exchange. His expression did not change, but his eyes did. Just briefly. Just enough. The particular look of someone who has witnessed a small, familiar absurdity and is choosing, out of respect, not to acknowledge it out loud. It was the most honest exchange she had the entire evening. By the time the coffee became a pattern, Celeste had stopped pretending it was a coincidence. She took her coffee the same way every morning. Black, with a half measure of oat milk added after, which was a specific enough preference that most people got it wrong even when she explained it clearly. The Hargrove house kitchen staff had been getting it wrong, in a pleasant and well-meaning way, for the better part of 2 years. Adrian got it right the first time, without asking, not because he had been briefed. She later confirmed that no one had briefed him. He had simply paid attention, the same way he paid attention to everything else in the Hargrove household, without drawing notice to the fact that he was doing it, and without expecting anything in return for having done it. In Celeste's world, that was not a small thing. It was Priya who said it first. Priya had been Celeste's closest friend since their 2nd year at university. Sharp, practical, and the kind of person who could assess a situation in 30 seconds and name the thing everyone else was still circling around. She visited the Connecticut estate once in early spring and watched Adrian for approximately 1 dinner before pulling Celeste aside afterward. "He watches you differently than he watches the room," she said, not accusingly, simply as a fact being submitted for consideration. Celeste was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know. And nothing. I am not being reckless, Priya. I see him too." That was all she offered, but it was the most certain she had sounded about anything in a long time. And Priya, who knew her better than almost anyone, did not push further. She simply nodded, slowly, the way people nod when they recognize that a decision has already been made. If this story is speaking to you, if you have ever been in a room full of people and felt genuinely seen by only one of them, hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Her name was Adrian Cole. She was 31 years old, a secondary school art teacher, and she drove the same route to work every morning for 4 years without incident. The morning she did not make it, a Hargrove logistics vehicle, a freight carrier running a contracted route through the same corridor, crossed into her lane on a rain-slicked overpass. The impact was not survivable. The investigation that followed lasted 11 days, produced a report that attributed the collision to adverse weather conditions, and was closed before anyone thought to ask why the vehicle's maintenance records, which should have flagged a brake calibration failure 3 service cycles earlier, had been filed correctly but never acted upon. Danya had been Adrian's younger sister. She had been the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday without writing it down, who made ordinary days feel worth noting, and whose absence left the kind of space that does not fill with time. It simply becomes something you learn to move around. The records were not obviously falsified. That was what made them so effective. They existed. They were dating. They bore the signatures of licensed technicians and the stamps of a certified maintenance facility that did, in fact, service Hargrove logistics vehicles on a regular schedule. Everything, at first glance, was in order. It was only when Adrian, 3 years after Danya's death, and only because a former transport inspector had reached out to him with information he said he could not in good conscience keep to himself, obtained the original service logs, and placed them beside the filed records that the discrepancy became visible. One entry, covering a brake system assessment, had been amended. The original notation flagged the calibration as outside acceptable range. The version that made it into the formal file read, "Within standard parameters." 4 words. The difference between accountability and absolution. 4 words that had allowed an entire chain of consequence to be buried under the weight of paperwork that looked, to anyone without the original to compare it against, entirely legitimate. Adrian's family had not gone without representation. There had been a lawyer, efficient, reassuring, and recommended by someone they had trusted, who negotiated a settlement within 8 weeks of the accident. The figure was, by the standards of the Cole family, significant. It came with a confidentiality agreement that was explained to them gently, in language that emphasized closure, dignity, and the importance of moving forward. His mother had signed it the same week she buried her daughter. Adrian had not been present for that conversation. He had been completing the final months of a private security contract overseas. By the time he returned, the money was in the account, the agreement was executed, and his mother, exhausted and doing what she believed was the only practical thing available to her, told him simply that it was done. She asked him not to reopen it. He had for 3 years honored that request, not because he agreed with it, because she had been through enough, and he was not willing to add to what she was carrying. Donna Calloway found him. She was 54 years old, a former logistics coordinator from Baltimore, and she had spent the better part of 2 years constructing a file of her own, methodically, without legal support, on a kitchen table covered in printed emails and photocopied invoices. Her son, Ryan, had died in a Hargrove logistics collision 14 months after Danya. Same corridor, same fleet, a different vehicle, but the same unresolved brake maintenance history running through the records like a thread no one had been meant to find. Donna had identified 6 other affected families. Not all of the cases involved fatalities. 2 were severe injury cases, one a near miss documented by a witness who had since moved abroad. But the pattern across all 7 incidents pointed to the same gap in the same maintenance chain, spanning nearly 4 years of overlooked reports and amended records. She had a name for the person she believed had authorized the amendment. She shared it with Adrian in a 2-hour phone call that he sat through without speaking more than a dozen words. Adrian Cole was not, by nature or by training, a man who acted on feeling alone. In 15 years of private security work, across assignments that had taken him through environments where the cost of poor judgment was rarely abstract, he had built his reputation on one thing above everything else: the reliable alignment of his conduct with his conscience. He did not cut corners. He did not look away when looking away was the easier option. He did not accept positions from people he could not respect, which made his presence in the Hargrove household a question he returned to regularly. In the still hours of the early morning when there was nothing to do but sit with the things he had not yet resolved, he was good at his work. He conducted himself without fault. He had given Warren Hargrove no reason to doubt his reliability and no cause to restrict his access to the household's innermost operations. And that access, he had come to understand, was the only instrument he had. He did not lie to himself about why he had taken the position. He had not come for revenge. He had examined that possibility with the same honesty he brought to everything, and set it aside. Revenge required a kind of heat that Adrian no longer had available. Time had not erased the knowledge of what had happened to Danya. It had moved it from the front of his chest to somewhere deeper and more settled, where it existed not as rage, but as weight. A permanent considered weight that informed every decision he made without controlling any of them. What remained, what kept him awake in the mornings when sleep left before he was ready was not anger. It was a question The question that Donna Calloway had placed at the end of their phone call. In a voice that carried no drama, only the steady exhaustion of someone who had been holding something for far too long. "At what point," she had said, "does knowing and staying silent make you part of it?" Adrian had no clean answer. He was still looking for one. It was a Tuesday evening in late October when Celeste first noticed that something had shifted in him. Not dramatically. Adrian Cole did not do anything dramatically. But she had been watching him long enough, and carefully enough to know the difference between his usual steadiness and the particular quality of stillness that meant a person was working very hard to appear undisturbed. He was standing near the East Terrace doors when she came downstairs after dinner. The house was settled. Her father had retired early. The staff had finished for the evening. It was just the two of them, and the kind of silence that a large house produces when everyone who fills it has withdrawn for the night. She poured 2 glasses of water from the carafe on the side table. She handed him one without asking. He accepted it without protest. Then she said, simply and without preamble, "You are somewhere else tonight." He looked at her steadily. "I am fine." She did not argue. She simply waited. She was very good at waiting. In the Hargrove household there were rules that had never been written down because they did not need to be. Staff did not socialize with family. The family did not inquire into the private lives of staff. Everyone understood their position in the architecture of the house and moved within it without friction. Celeste had understood those rules her entire life. She understood them now. She stepped past them anyway. "We do not have to call it a conversation," she said, moving toward the terrace doors and pushing them open without waiting for his response. The October air came in cold and clean against the warmth of the house. She stepped outside, and after a moment in which he made a visible internal decision about what kind of person he was going to be in this particular situation, Adrian followed. They stood at the railing together. The grounds stretched out below them, dark and still, and she said, without pressure, without urgency, "Start with the ones you do not know how to say." He did not say it cleanly. That was the thing she would remember most afterward. Not the content of what he said, but the texture of how he said it. There was no structure to it, no rehearsed sequence. It comes out the way things come out when a person has held them for long enough, that the holding itself has become its own kind of exhaustion. He told her about Danya first, not the accident, the person. The birthday cards, sent without fail to people Danya had met only once. The habit of calling at inconvenient hours just to share something she had read that she thought he would find interesting. The way she laughed before the punchline of her own jokes, every single time, without correction, without embarrassment. Then he told her about the vehicle, the records, the 4-word amendment that had turned negligence into a clean file. The settlement his mother had signed while he was thousands of miles away, completing a contract he could not leave, in a city he would always associate afterward with the phone call that reached him there. He told her about Donna Calloway, the 6 other families. The 2-year kitchen table file was built without legal support and without any guarantee that anyone would ever listen. He told her all of it. Standing at the railing of her father's terrace, looking not at her, but at the darkness beyond the grounds. The way people look when they are finally releasing something they have been afraid to release for a very long time. Celeste did not speak, not once. Through all of it, she did not reach for his arm. She did not offer the small, cushioning interjections that most people instinctively produce when someone near them is in pain. The sounds and phrases that are, more often than not, about the listener's discomfort rather than the speaker's need. She simply listened, with the full, deliberate attention of someone who understood, from a lifetime spent in rooms where real things were never said, exactly how rare it was when someone chose to say a real thing out loud to another person without softening it first. When he finished, the silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of something that had needed to exist for a long time, and had finally been given the space to do so. She let it stand. Then she turned to look at him, fully, directly, for the first time since they had stepped outside into the cold. "You have been protecting me," she said slowly, "while carrying this." It was not a question. She was not asking him to confirm it. She was naming what she had heard. placing it in front of both of them plainly, the way she approached everything that mattered to her. He did not answer immediately. Then, "I was not sure what the right thing was, but you knew," she said. "That is different from not knowing." She turned back to the railing then, both hands resting on the cold stone, and looked out at the grounds below. The Hargrove estate at night was a study in engineered stillness. The shaped hedges, the lit pathways, the careful and deliberate arrangement of everything in its designated place. She looked at it for a long time. Something in her face changed while she was looking at it. Not suddenly. Gradually, the way a decision looks when it moves from consideration into something fixed and certain. Adrian watched it happen and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Some moments do not need commentary. They only need to be witnessed. When she spoke again, her voice was measured. There was nothing uncertain in it. "My father built all of this," she said, "every part of it. And I have benefited from every part of it, my entire life. Without asking questions I should have asked a long time ago." She paused. The pause was not for effect. It was the pause of someone choosing their next words with care, because the words mattered. "I am not going to be that person. The one who knows and adjusts, and finds a way to continue living comfortably inside something that should not be comfortable." Adrian was very still beside her. "What are you going to do?" he asked. She stepped back from the railing, and when she turned to face him, she was not the assembled version of Celeste Hargrove, not the product of galas and curated introductions, and the long, careful performance of a life arranged for other people's approval. She was simply herself, clear, resolved, and entirely at peace with what that was going to cost her. "I am going to find out exactly what happened," she said, "and then I am going to decide what to do with what I find." She did not go to him immediately. That would have been the impulsive version of this, and Celeste Hargrove was not impulsive. She spent 3 weeks doing what she had always done best, paying attention. She went through everything Adrian had shared with her. She cross-referenced it against documents she had legitimate access to through her nominal role in the family's philanthropic foundation. She spoke twice more with Donna Calloway. Long calls that left her sitting in silence afterward, not from overwhelm, but from the particular stillness of someone who has heard enough to know exactly what they are going to do next. She told Priya, who listened without interrupting, and then said simply, "I know you have already decided." Celeste confirmed that she had, and then, on a Thursday morning in November, the same day her chrysanthemums arrived correctly, without incident, as they always did now, she walked into her father's private study, closed the door behind her, and sat down across from him at his desk. She did not open with an accusation. She opened with a question. "Dad," she said, "I need you to tell me about the Hargrove Logistics Maintenance Review from 4 years ago." Warren Hargrove had spent 40 years in rooms where the ability to remain composed under pressure was not merely useful, but essential. Celeste had watched him absorb hostile takeover bids, regulatory inquiries, and the particular brutality of a public relations crisis with the same measured expression, alert, unreadable, and positioned slightly above whatever was happening around him. She had never, in 23 years, seen his face crack. It cracked now, not into tears, not into anger, into something quieter and more devastating than either, a sudden and visible exhaustion, as though the effort of holding a particular shape for a very long time had finally, in this room, with this person, exceeded everything he had left to spend on it. He looked at his desk for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "How much do you know?" he asked. "Enough," she said, "but I want to hear it from you." He did not confess to everything at once. It came in layers, the way truth surfaces from people who have learned over a long career to release only what is necessary and retain the rest. But Celeste was patient, and she had the kind of specific, documented knowledge that made careful evasion a costly exercise. Gradually, across an hour that neither of them would ever fully describe to another person, the shape of what had happened emerged. He had not ordered the records amended directly, but he had known. He had been informed by someone within the logistics chain whose role it was to bring him problems before they became public liabilities, and he had made a decision not to falsify, but not to correct, to allow what was already in place to stand undisturbed and to trust that it would hold. When he finished, Celeste was quiet for a moment. Then she said what she had come to say. "You can get ahead of this, or you can be consumed by it. That choice is still yours. But it has a window, and the window is closing." Warren Hargrove took 4 days. Celeste did not contact him during those days, and he did not contact her. She learned afterward from the housekeeper, not from him, that he had spent most of those 4 days alone in his study, and that on the 3rd evening he had placed a call to his lawyer that lasted less than 10 minutes. Whatever was said in that call, it was enough. On the 5th day, through a process that Celeste was deliberately not party to, because there were things she could influence and things that needed to happen without her involvement, the information reached a journalist at a national publication who had been independently investigating Hargrove logistics for the better part of 8 months. The story ran on a Wednesday. By Friday, the company's publicly traded holdings had shed 19% of their value. By the following Tuesday, 2 non-executive board members had submitted their resignations. A third announced he would not seek renewal of his directorship at the close of the current term. The infrastructure of the Hargrove empire did not collapse, but it shifted, visibly, measurably, in ways that no statement could attribute to market conditions or absorb with careful language. Donna Calloway called Celeste the morning the story ran. She did not say a great deal. She had never been a person who used more words than a situation required. But near the end of the call, after the practical matters had been covered, the legal team that had reached out, the process that had been laid out for her, the timeline she had been given, she said something that Celeste held on to long after the call ended. "Ryan's name is in the article," she said. "His name is in it. Not as a number. As a person." Within 6 weeks, all 7 families had received new settlements, unconditional, substantially larger than the original figures, and unaccompanied by confidentiality agreements of any kind. The silence that had been purchased the first time around was not offered for sale again. Adrian's mother did not call him when the paperwork arrived. She drove to his apartment and sat with him at his kitchen table, and neither of them said very much. That, in its own way, was exactly enough. Warren Hargrove's public statement was released on a Monday, 3 weeks after the story ran. It was not written by his communications team, though they had offered. It was not reviewed by legal counsel, though they had strongly advised it be. It was 4 paragraphs long, and it read, unmistakably, to anyone familiar with the polished, managed language of corporate accountability, like something a person had written themselves, alone, without assistance, at considerable personal cost. It acknowledged the maintenance failure. It acknowledged that he had been informed and had chosen not to act. It did not reach for the passive constructions that allow a person to accept a version of responsibility that costs them nothing. It did not use the word oversight. It is named Adrian Cole. It is named Ryan Calloway. It named all 7 people by their full names, in a single paragraph, without qualifier or condition. It was painful to read. It was imperfect in its phrasing, and it was, by every measure that mattered, true. This is the part of the story that does not get talked about enough. The cost of doing the right thing, and the fact that the cost is always real. We want to hear from you. Comment below. Have you ever had to choose between loyalty and truth? Have you ever known something that put you in an impossible position? Tell us your story. We read every single one. Adrian submitted his resignation the same morning the story ran, before the stock markets opened, before the board convened, before Warren Hargrove had released a single word publicly. He had written it the night before, not in reaction to the publication, but because he had known, from the moment he stood on that terrace in October and said everything out loud, that this was always where it was going to end, not in termination, not in confrontation. In the deliberate act of a man who understood that you cannot serve with integrity inside a house you have helped to expose. The letter was 4 sentences long. It thanked Warren Hargrove for the professional opportunity. It offered 2 weeks of transition support. It explained nothing beyond that. He did not believe it required explanation. There were people, Priya among them, when Celeste told her, who framed Adrian's resignation as a kind of professional consequence, as though he had done something that made his position untenable and was now absorbing the cost of it. That was not how Adrian understood what he had done. He had not left because he had been compromised. He had left because staying would have compromised him. There is a meaningful difference between those two things, and it was precisely the kind of difference that Adrian Cole had spent his entire career being able to identify without hesitation. The position had served its purpose. He had done what his conscience required. Remaining afterward, drawing a salary from a household now publicly associated with what he had helped bring forward, was not something he was willing to rationalize, regardless of how it might have appeared from the outside. He left without announcement. That was the only way he knew how to leave anything. 3 weeks passed without contact between them. This was not a distance born of regret. It was not hostility or reconsideration. It was the natural pause that follows something significant, the interval after a large stone has been dropped into still water, when everything needs a moment to settle before either party can assess clearly what has changed and what remains. Celeste was occupied. The weeks following the story were not restful ones. There were conversations with lawyers, with the foundation board, with family members she had not spoken to in years, who suddenly had considered opinions about her choices and felt entitled to share them. She moved through all of it, with the same steady attention she brought to everything that mattered. But she thought about the terrace. She thought about the October cold, and the way he had looked at the darkness beyond the grounds while he told her about Danya. She thought, more than once, about the coffee order he had gotten right the very first time without being told. He called on a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks and 2 days after the story ran. She saw his name on the screen and felt something settle in her. Not surprise exactly, but the particular relief of something arriving at exactly the moment it was supposed to, without having been forced or negotiated into existence. She answered on the second ring. "Hey," he said. His voice was the same as it always was, steady, considered, carrying that quality of settled calm that had distinguished him from every other person in the Hargrove household from the very first day she had noticed him. "Hey," she said back. A brief pause followed, comfortable rather than strained. The pause of 2 people who had already said the hardest things to each other and were now simply finding the right register for what came after all of that. "How are you?" he asked. She considered the question for a moment. In another version of her life, the version assembled from galas and engineered introductions, and the long practice of saying exactly the right amount without giving anything real away, she would have answered efficiently. "Fine. Busy. Managing." The words that fill space without cost. Instead she said, "Honest answer?" "Always," he said. "Tired," she told him. "But the good kind? The kind that comes from actually doing something, rather than maintaining appearances." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, I know that kind." It was not a remarkable exchange by any external measure, but it was entirely true from both of them, without softening or performance. And between these 2 particular people, after everything they had moved through together, that counted for considerably more than remarkable. Near the end of the call, after they had talked for a while about nothing that required resolution, a book she had started and put down and started again, a neighborhood he had recently moved to, the specific and apparently universal difficulty of finding coffee prepared with any real consistency. He said it without building toward it, without ceremony, without making it larger than it needed to be. "There is a place near me," he said, "that gets the coffee right. First attempt, no clarification required." She smiled. He could not see it, but she suspected, knowing him as well as she now did, that he was aware of it anyway. "Sunday?" she said. "Sunday," he confirmed, and that was all it needed to be. 2 people on the other side of something hard, choosing, carefully, without rushing, in the understated way that real things tend to begin, to find out what came next. Here's the thing about Celeste Hargrove's story that resists the easy version of itself. She did not choose the truth, because it was cost-free. She did not choose it because the path ahead was clear, or because someone had assured her that everything would resolve itself cleanly on the other side. She chose it with full knowledge of what it was going to dismantle. The family structure she had grown up inside. The public image she had spent years adjacent to. The version of her father she had spent her whole life trying to reach through every closed door and calibrated silence. The cost was real. The relationships that came under strain in the weeks and months following did not all recover. There were family members who felt she had chosen exposure over loyalty, and who said so directly, and who took considerable time, some of them more than she had expected, to find their way back to her. She had known that was coming before she walked into that study. She had walked in anyway, not because it was easy, because living inside the alternative was no longer something she was willing to do. There is a particular kind of courage required to move towards someone that the structure of your life has quietly designated as unsuitable. Not reckless courage, not the courage of someone who has failed to understand the stakes. The courage of someone who understands them completely, who can see every reason the world would offer for stepping back and every convention that would support that stepping back, and who decides with open eyes and a clear head that the person in front of them is worth more than the comfort of compliance. Celeste did not fall into Adrian. She chose him, deliberately, without apology, in the same considered way she made every decision that genuinely mattered to her. And he chose her back with the same quality of intention, not because their circumstances were uncomplicated, because what existed between them was honest. And they had both lived long enough inside worlds built on performance to recognize the difference between something honest and something constructed. The world has opinions about who belongs with whom. Those opinions are rarely worth the weight people assign to them. One of the quieter lessons in this story belongs to Adrian. He did not come forward publicly. He did not give interviews or position himself as the central figure in what had happened. When the story ran and requests for comment followed, he declined every one with the same composed restraint he brought to everything else in his life. His integrity had never required an audience. It had always been a private practice. The daily, unglamorous work of aligning his actions with his conscience in rooms where no one was watching and no recognition was on offer. The terrace conversation had not been a performance of honesty. It had been the latest in a long series of honest choices he had been making, without announcement, for his entire adult life. That is what integrity actually looks like from the inside, not the moment of public declaration, the accumulated weight of every private moment that made the public one possible. What grew between Celeste and Adrian did not arrive fully formed on a terrace in October. It had been assembling itself in elevators, and florist mix-ups, and glances held a half-second longer than necessary for the better part of a year before either of them named it. It was built from small, consistent acts of attention, from the particular respect of two people who had no interest in being anything other than exactly what they were with each other, even when everything around them rewarded the opposite. And it was tested, not hypothetically, genuinely tested, by stakes that were high and consequences that were real and outcomes that neither of them could fully control. They had stood on opposite sides of a truth that could have driven them apart, and had chosen, separately and then together, to stand on the same side of it instead. That is not a romantic storyline. That is the actual foundation of something that lasts, built slowly, held honestly, stronger for having been tested by something that genuinely mattered. Before we close, we want to leave you with something to carry with you, not conclusions, questions, because the best stories do not tell you what to think. They give you something to take back into your own life and sit with. Is there something you know, something you have been holding carefully and privately for longer than is comfortable, that deserves to be said out loud? Is there someone in your life who sees you the way Adrian saw Celeste, not the version you present, but the version you actually are? And are you allowing them to? Is there a version of integrity you have been deferring, waiting for a cleaner moment, a lower cost, a more convenient set of circumstances that is never going to arrive on those particular terms? Celeste did not wait for the perfect moment. She decided that the imperfect one in front of her was the only one that was actually available, and that it was enough. It was, "I am Mr. Ravel, and if you have stayed with this story from the beginning, thank you, genuinely and without reservation. These are the stories I care most about bringing to you, not because they are dramatic, though they are, not because they are uncommon, though they are that too, but because somewhere inside them is something true about what it costs to be a person of conscience in a world that frequently and generously rewards the opposite." Celeste Hargrove did not become someone new the night she sat across from her father and told him he had a choice. She became more fully who she had always been. That is what truth does. When you choose it with both eyes open, it does not change you, it confirms you. If this story reached something in you, subscribe to this channel, because we bring you stories like this every single week. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that doing the right thing is always worth it, even when the cost is real. And leave a comment. Tell us which part of Celeste's story stayed with you the most. We are always reading. We will see you in the next one. 6 months after the story ran, Celeste Hargrove left the philanthropic foundation, not in anger, not as a statement. She left the way she did most things, deliberately, after considerable thought, with a clear sense of what she was moving toward rather than simply what she was leaving behind. She had spent enough of her life inside structures built by other people, arranged around other people's priorities, and maintained for other people's comfort. She was done, at 23, with living inside rooms she had not chosen. She took a position with a mid-sized legal advocacy organization that worked specifically on corporate negligence cases. The kind of cases where the distance between what was documented and what was true tended to be exactly 4 words wide. She was not a lawyer. She did not need to be. What she brought to the work was something the organization had struggled to find in the people it hired: the particular practiced ability to sit across from a room full of careful people and identify, without drama, exactly what was not being said. She was very good at it. She had been training for it her entire life. Adrian Cole did not return to private household security. He took a 6-week contract in the interim. Straightforward work, the kind that required his body and his training and left his mind free to process everything that had settled and everything that had not. Then he accepted a position with an independent corporate investigations firm whose work sat at the intersection of the kind of thing he had spent 15 years learning to read and the kind of accountability he had spent the last 2 years trying to locate. He was, by every account from the people who worked alongside him, exceptionally good at the job. He had a reputation for finding the discrepancy that everyone else had looked at and walked past. His colleagues attributed it to experience. He knew it was something else. The particular quality of attention that develops in a person who has spent years looking for the thing that does not quite match the paperwork it is supposed to match. He thought about Dania often, not with grief in the old destabilizing sense, but with the steady, grounded awareness of someone who carries a person they loved into every room they enter as a kind of orientation, a reminder of what the work was actually for. Warren Hargrove stepped back from the active leadership of his companies 4 months after the story ran. He did not disappear. He did not retreat into silence or relocate to somewhere the name meant less. He remained in Connecticut, in the house that now echoed differently than it had before. Not with the hollow performance of a life arranged to impress, but with something raw and less curated. He was, by several accounts from people who knew him in the period that followed, a man in the process of becoming acquainted with himself at a late stage of life. That process was not comfortable. He did not appear to expect it to be. He and Celeste did not repair their relationship quickly. That would have been the easy version, and neither of them was interested in the easy version. What they built instead, slowly and without pretense, was something more durable, a connection stripped of performance, grounded in the acknowledgement of what had happened and the shared, unspoken commitment to not look away from it. It was not the father-daughter relationship either of them had had before. It was something more honest than that. Donna Calloway did not stop working after the settlements came through. She had spent 2 years building a file on a kitchen table without any assurance that anyone would ever listen. The settlements were not the finish line for her. They were confirmation that the work had been worth doing, and that more work of the same kind needed to be done. She partnered with 2 of the other affected families to establish a small advocacy group focused specifically on corporate vehicle maintenance. Accountability, the gap between what regulations required and what companies, under pressure and without sufficient oversight, sometimes chose to file instead. The organization was not large. It did not need to be large to matter. She named it after Ryan. Not loudly, not as a monument, simply as a grounding, a reminder, printed on every document the organization produced, of what the work was rooted in, and who it was ultimately for. The first Sunday coffee became a second. The second became a third. By the time spring arrived, the kind of spring that comes to the city gradually, in increments, as though it is not entirely sure it has permission to stay, it had become the reliable architecture of their week. Not dramatic, not announced to anyone in particular, simply present, in the way that real things tend to be present, without requiring the world's acknowledgement in order to exist. They did not move quickly. That was not who either of them was. They moved the way they did everything that mattered, with attention, with patience, with a willingness to let something develop at the pace it needed rather than the pace that would have been easier to explain to other people. Priya, visiting on an afternoon in April, watched them together over coffee at a small table near the window and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, to no one in particular, "Well, that makes sense." It did. It always had. There is a version of bravery that the world recognizes immediately, the loud version, the version that arrives with witnesses and applause and a clear narrative of heroism that everyone can point to and understand. And then there is the version that Celeste Hargrove practiced, the version that lives in the decision to keep your hands flat on the table when every instinct tells you to fold them in your lap, in the willingness to sit across from someone you love and say the true thing, knowing full well that the true thing is going to cost you something you cannot fully calculate in advance. It does not look like bravery from the outside. It looks like a young woman sitting at a dining table with cold food in front of her, asking her father a question he has been hoping for 4 years that nobody would ask. But that is the quietest kind of brave, the kind that does not wait for the right moment or the guaranteed outcome, the kind that simply decides in an ordinary room, on an ordinary evening, that silence has been the wrong choice for long enough. Celeste Hargrove decided that, and everything, every settlement, every resigned board member, every family whose loss was finally acknowledged by name, followed from that one quiet, irreversible decision. She did not change the world. She changed her corner of it, and she did it by doing the thing she had always been built to do. She paid attention, and then she refused to pretend she hadn't. If this story moved you, subscribe to this channel and share it with someone who needs it today. Every story we tell is for the person who is sitting with something heavy and wondering whether saying it out loud is worth the cost. It is. It always is. Leave us a comment. Tell us what this story meant to you, and we will see you next time.